أجمعين أما بعد. We all know that there is difficulty involved with being different and with being a minority against a majority. Even the Prophet ﷺ mentioned this in the hadith. بدأ الإسلام غريبا وسيعود غريبا كما بدأ. Islam began as something strange and it will return to be something strange just as it began. Meaning, Muslims were a minority, they were different, they stood out, then they become the majority and their behavior becomes the norm. And then there will be a time when Islam will become something strange and the believers will be different again. And the Prophet ﷺ ends the hadith by saying, فَطُوبَى لِلْغُرَبَاءِ, glad tidings to those who are different. And he ended it with something positive, with glad tidings, because there's difficulty in being different and difficulty in being a minority amongst a majority. But what is interesting is that you find some Muslims, they try to hide their Islam, hide the fact that they're Muslim or change their name, and they live amongst the people who don't hide their purple hair and their orange dyed hair and their piercings and their tattoos on their face, and they're proud of it. Or in their bumper sticker they're telling you about things that they shouldn't be telling you. And the Muslim is ashamed of that. And people will also try to put the Muslim to shame and make them feel ashamed of who they are and how they are and what they believe. But what is interesting is that there will be a day when they will wish they were just like the Muslims. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, رُبَمَا يَوَدُّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَوْ كَانُوا مُسْلِمِينَ. And rubama is language of uncertainty. It means perhaps or maybe. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no uncertainty. So even if you find language that to you and me is language of uncertainty, in the Quran we read it as language of certainty. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything, knows the future precisely and exactly. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying the non-believers will wish, meaning there will be a time or a day when the non-believers will wish that they were Muslims. So the scholars said, when will this happen? And some said that this will happen at the time of death. And they said that there's no evidence to support that though. That at the time of death, because the angel of death comes in a different form from the believer to the non-believer. So to the non-believer he'll come in a scary form and he will yank out the soul. So some scholars said this is when they will wish that they were believers. They spent their whole life ridiculing the believers, making fun of the believers, and now when death comes they will wish that they were believers. That's one opinion. The second opinion says on the day of judgment, because on the day of judgment, what is right, what is wrong is clear. It's black and white. Nobody defends a sin. Everybody knows it was a sin. So on that day, they will know that they were wrong and they wish that they were believers. And then the third opinion, and some scholars argue this is the strongest of them, that this happens in the hellfire. May Allah protect us and our families from that. And they say that the kuffar, the unbelievers, will be in the hellfire. And there will be some Muslims who disobeyed Allah Azza wa Jal, and they're also in the hellfire. So the unbelievers will say to them, we didn't believe in Allah, and that's why we're here. But look at you, you were Muslims and you were also in here with us. But as you know, the Muslims will not spend all eternity in the hellfire. They stay there until it expiates the amount of sins that they've committed, then they're taken out of the hellfire. So when all the believers are finally taken out of the hellfire, this is when they will wish that they were Muslims. رُبَمَا يَوَدُّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَوْ كَانُوا مُسْلِمِينَ. So it takes us to a story that the scholars mention of from the early Muslims. And there was a battle where the Muslims had besieged a specific Christian group. And they were in their fortress. It was a very strong fortress. And they laid siege to them for a long time. And they weren't able to break the fortress basically, or get them to surrender. One of the soldiers was in the army and he was known as Ibn AbdirRahman. They referred to him as Ibn AbdirRahman. And one day he saw a woman. She peered over the wall of the fortress and he became attracted to her. And this attraction grew and grew and grew in his heart until he asked her one day, كَيْفَ السَّبِيلُ إِلَيْكِ? What is the way to get to you? And she said, you have no way to get to me unless you become a Christian. So he was so blinded by his love and his affection for her that he actually became a Christian. Even though he was a mujahid in the army, he left the army and became a Christian and went into that fortress. And the siege failed and the Muslim army packed up and they left. And many years later, a group of those same soldiers passed by this fortress. And when they passed by the fortress and there's no battle, there's no war now between them, they remembered their friend Ibn AbdirRahman and they became saddened that they lost him. So they stood outside the fortress and they just kept yelling, Yabna AbdirRahim, Yabna AbdirRahim. And then he looked over the wall and they asked him, what has become of your salah? And what has become of your Quran? So he started to cry. And he says, Wallahi, I have forgotten the entire Quran. And the only verse that I remember, رُبَمَا يَوَدُّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَوْ كَانُوا مُسْلِمِينَ. The non-believers will wish that they were Muslims. The reminder for me and for my brothers and sisters, we're never ashamed of being the only nation on earth that's guided. We're never ashamed of being the only ones who will not spend all eternity in the hellfire. Nobody can put us to shame. Nobody can make us feel beneath them. Because we're the ones who are supposed to guide the rest of humanity. And the ones who guide, they're in the position of the educator. And the educator is never in the same position as the one he's educating. And that's why da'wah is one of the ways you never feel beneath anyone. No one can make you feel embarrassed or ashamed of yourself or ashamed of any aspect of your religion. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us and keep our children steadfast.
Ameen.
For attentive listening. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.